Previously.
This is a question of, is it in fact the case? Is it consistent with reality that there is a God?
The celebrity atheist types, because I actually like that phrase, they don't seem to me to be contending with the real issues.
You can stop smoking without any sort of supernatural intervention.
No, not really!
Belief is the state of being convinced that a proposition is true or likely true.
Mystical experience.
Are there no godless artists and poets?
There are artists and poets who think they're godless.
So we might have crossed over into a problem area.
Yeah, no doubt. We do ride around on the shoulders of giants, and the figure of Christ, psychologically speaking, is the giant among giants. It's a meta-giant. It's a ritual model for emulation, and the ritual model is something like: pick up your tab, suffering, and bear it nobly, which is a metaphysical statement in some sense that lies at the bottom of the ethic even Matt is presenting. And so it is deeply embedded in a religious substructure, and that's the metaphorical substructure I was talking about, that necessarily underlies these self-evident axiomatic rules, which are not by any means, as you point out, self-evident in the least. There are plenty of cultures that train their young men to be absolutely barbaric. Monsters, right. Warriors, killers, right. Bloodthirsty, right to the core. Perfectly viable mode of being, arguably speaking, from the perspective of generating a set of axiomatic rules. Why is it not better to have 10,000 women than one? There's an evolutionary question for you. Well, reasonable people wouldn't do that. Yeah. Right! Reasonable people! Yeah.
So if it's not clear, I can point to the giant. I can't point to the mega giant.
It's because it's an abstraction!
Sure, but if you hold Christ up as a particular figure, the only information I have about Jesus comes from the Bible. And Jesus gave some good advice, and some crappy advice, and some questionable advice, and that's not enough. And there's not a secular humanist organization or country on the planet that's ever produced as a good thing, as an intentional good thing, murderers.
That's highly debatable. That's highly debatable.
Actually, it's absolutely true, because there's never been a secular humanist government on the planet.
Well, I don't know. I think the Soviets were pretty secular.
I know. With all due apologies, you do not know the first thing about what secular humanism is. You should read the secular humanist manifestos, because what happened in Russia and in communist countries was an institution of a religious-like structure centered around an individual and forced atheism, none of which is consistent with humanism. None of it. And we can talk about this later. I'd be happy to point you to this, because you can say that it was an atheist thing that went awry, but you can't call it secular humanism. It's just not there. There's no humanism in what was done there. What, in your view, would a genuine atheist be like?
He'd be like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. And I can't really come up with a better answer than that, because it's such a complicated question that's the right answer. You know, I love that book. It's an amazing book, and it's a great thriller, by the way. If there are some of you, perhaps many of you, who haven't read it, you really should read it, because it might be the greatest novel ever written. I think you could make a case for that. It's unbelievably exciting once you get into it. And Raskolnikov, he plots the perfect murder. It's so interesting because the last thing Dostoevsky ever did was make a straw man out of his opponents, let's say. What Dostoevsky did in all of his great novels was make each of the positions he was trying to contend with as powerful as he possibly could. And since he was an absolutely spectacular genius, he could really do that. So Raskolnikov plots a murder, and he murders this horrible woman, who's horrible according to everyone who knows her, who also has enslaved her rather mentally feeble niece, who does nothing but make people miserable consciously all the time. And he does that in order to save his sister from a rather sophisticated form of prostitution, to save himself from starvation, so that he can become a great lawyer and help people. So Dostoevsky sets up the stage. Here's a perfect situation for a murder. All the rational choices point in that direction, and Raskolnikov, who's sort of torturing himself, or who's sort of tortured because he's hungry and not very well, not thinking very clearly, he undertakes the murder and gets away with it. And before he does it, he berates himself in what I would describe as the negative atheistic style. And he basically says, look, there's every rational reason to split this woman's head with an axe. Look at all the good I would do. Look at all the well-being I would enhance. And so he does it, and all hell breaks loose. See, Raskolnikov built himself up to the murder, in part by laying out the rational case, but also by saying, well, there's no God. There's no metaphysical reason that's stopping me from committing this act. And there's all these reasons that appear perfectly rational that are pushing me in that direction. Perhaps I'm nothing but a moral coward for failing to undertake it. So he does. But what he finds out is that he broke an inviolable moral rule, something that spoke to his own soul, so to speak. And the rest of the book basically involves his sequential post-traumatic unraveling. And the post-traumatic issue is very interesting, because one of the things you do see happening with post-traumatic stress disorder, it very often occurs in people who watch themselves do something of great malevolence. By their own admission, I'm not projecting this onto them. They've stepped outside the ancient moral code unwittingly and conducted themselves in a manner they cannot reconcile themselves to, and they are permanently broken. So there are works like that, Crime and Punishment, first and foremost, I would say, that do a lovely job of elucidating in narrative form how these self-evident moral presuppositions are necessarily nested inside this broader narrative metaphorical substrate, and that you use your rationality divorced from that metaphorical substrate at your peril. And I believe that to be the case. I think that's an accurate psychological summation.
Thank you. I'm curious if Matt has any thoughts on that.
You think? So it's rather surprising, and I promise you I don't mean this to be insulting, because I definitely place you considerably higher than most of the apologists that I've engaged with. But there's a common theme from the apologists, and that is, you're not really an atheist. Because now in Dr. Peterson's case, it's you're not really an atheist. Because in my mind, an atheist is someone who would be a murderer. And so rather than saddle you with that, you just think you're an atheist, but you're really not. From other apologists, it's you think you're an atheist, but you're not, because God's written his moral code on your heart. This is essentially, as far as I can tell, what was expressed in some way, that there's a moral foundation, a moral center that God has imbued people with, and that we all know this, or we all recognize it. You're not really an atheist, or this is what an atheist would do. An atheist is somebody who doesn't believe there's a God. I'm not convinced there's a God. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm convinced there are no gods, although that is a subset that says I believe there are no gods. This is, as I've talked about previously, independent of whether or not I can be a moral being or do good things. Independent of whether there's awe and wonder and purpose and meaning in my life. There were atheist fans who wrote me that were like, oh man, I can't wait for you to do the conversation with Jordan. And I was like, cool. And still, I hope we have many more conversations as well. Cause just saying one thing that I find irritating's never gonna be enough to get rid of me. But I asked them, great, I'm not that familiar with him. What is it about him that you like? And what are the concerns? And they came back with a bunch of things. And none of them said anything about agreeing with views on religion. And they seemed very confused on those things. And so the good news for them is that while he thinks atheists would be murderers, he doesn't actually think you're an atheist. And that is his way of getting around acknowledging things that conflict with his worldview. I don't get to decide who is or isn't a true Christian. I didn't even get to decide that when I was a believer. I definitely don't get to do it now. And so if somebody tells me that they're a Christian, I'm gonna have to accept that. I have a model in my head of what that means. I have a model in my head of what it means to be Muslim. But I'm willing for them to explain what their model is. I know people who identify as Christian atheists. They really love the stuff that Jesus said, but they don't actually believe in God. You know, Thomas Jefferson famously cut out the Jefferson Bible and removed every reference to the supernatural and miracles and things like that, because he really admired the teachings of it. And sure, I think you could be a cultural Christian if you wanted to. It's strange to me I'm not sitting here with somebody like Ray Comfort when I'm told you're not really an atheist because you're too good to be an atheist. This is what atheists hear all the time. They've been sidelined because of religious privilege around the world for years. They come out to their family members or friends or people they've known for years. And they're like, you're an atheist, how could that be? You're such a good person, I've known you all this time. It's because the mindset people have about what an atheist is has been poisoned by religious proclamations. We have been denigrated from the pulpit, and it has seeped into every aspect of culture.